February 19th, 1945, 0400 hours. The pre-dawn darkness off the coast of Iwo Jima trembles with the rumble of diesel engines. In the belly of transport ship USS Missoula, Marine Corporal James Bradley checks his rifle for the 7th time. Around him, 300 men crowd into the cargo hold, waiting for the order that will send them into hell. Through the steel hull, they can hear a sound that will define the next month of their lives. The distinctive growl of hundreds of Higgins boats circling in the Black Pacific waters. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese Imperial General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stands in his underground command post 500 meters inland from the beach. He has spent 8 months transforming this volcanic island into a fortress of concrete and steel. His intelligence reports are clear. The Americans will attempt an amphibious assault, but their landing craft cannot possibly deliver enough men fast enough to overwhelm his defenses. The mathematics are simple. The beaches are narrow, the approaches are confined. His guns command every meter of sand. Even if the Americans land, they will be slaughtered faster than they can reinforce. What Kuribayashi does not know is that circling offshore are 450 Higgins boats, simple plywood craft designed by a New Orleans boat builder who never finished high school. These unglamorous vessels are about to rewrite the rules of amphibious warfare and shatter every assumption the Japanese have made about what is possible on a defended beach. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how a Louisiana boat designer's simple idea transformed modern warfare, how Japanese military planners fatally underestimated American industrial ingenuity, and how 30,000 Marines stormed a beach that was supposed to be impregnable, all because one man refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in the swamps of Louisiana, years before the first shot of World War II was fired. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a military man. He was a lumber merchant and boat builder in New Orleans, a self-taught engineer with an 8th grade education and an obstinate belief that he could design a better shallow watercraft than anyone else in America. In 1938, Higgins was building boats for oil companies working in Louisiana bayous. His Eureka design, a flat-bottomed craft with a protected propeller and a unique bow shape, could navigate waters just 18 inches deep. The vessel could run right up onto muddy banks, unload cargo, and reverse back into deep water without getting stuck. For swamp work, it was perfect. For military operations, it was invisible. The United States Marine Corps in the late 1930s was a force of just 18,000 men, poorly funded and operating with equipment left over from World War I. Their amphibious doctrine was primitive. Existing landing craft was slow, cumbersome, and required cranes to lower them from transport ships. Worse, they had no bow ramps. Marines had to climb over the sides, dropping into chest-deep water under enemy fire, losing cohesion before even reaching the beach. Marine planners understood the problem, but lacked a solution. Every design they tested failed in some critical way. Too slow, too fragile, drew too much water, couldn't retract from beaches. The consensus among naval architects was that the perfect landing craft simply couldn't be built. The requirements were contradictory. You couldn't have speed and shallow draft and durability and cargo capacity all in one vessel. Andrew Higgins thought differently. In 1938, a Marine officer named Victor Krulak saw one of Higgins's swamp boats and recognized its potential immediately. He reported back to headquarters. This craft could revolutionize amphibious operations. The Marine Corps, desperate for solutions, invited Higgins to submit a design for military evaluation. What Higgins proposed was radical in its simplicity. Take his shallow draft swamp boat, widen it, add a bow ramp that could drop instantly upon beaching and protect the engine with armored housing. The result would be a craft that could carry 36 combat-loaded troops, approach a beach at 9 knots, ground itself in just 3 feet of water, drop its ramp, disgorge its cargo in 30 seconds, and retract back into deep water, all while under fire. The Navy Bureau of Ships dismissed the design as amateurish. Professional naval architects scoffed at Higgins' lack of formal training. The flat bottom would make the craft unstable in open water. They argued the exposed bow ramp would be vulnerable to enemy fire. The plywood construction would never withstand combat conditions. The entire concept violated established principles of naval engineering, but the Marines were willing to try anything. In 1941, they ordered a small batch of prototypes for testing. The trials in Quantico, Virginia, revealed something extraordinary. Higgins' boat worked exactly as promised. It was fast, maneuverable, and could deposit Marines on a beach with unprecedented speed. More importantly, it was cheap and simple to build. A single boat required just 1,000 hours of labor and cost less than $10,000. The Japanese military, meanwhile, was developing its own amphibious doctrine based on entirely different assumptions. Japanese war planners studied the failed British landing at Gallipoli in World War I and concluded that defended beaches were nearly impossible to storm. Their strategy relied on this premise: build powerful, fixed defenses, force the enemy to come to you and destroy them in the water or on the beach before they can consolidate. Japanese intelligence officers studied American military capabilities extensively in the years before Pearl Harbor. They knew the United States had a small Marine Corps and limited amphibious experience. They observed American landing exercises in the Caribbean and noted the clumsy, slow process of getting troops ashore. Their assessment was recorded in Imperial Navy planning documents. American amphibious capability is primitive. They lack purpose-built landing craft and rely on improvised solutions. Any attempt to storm a fortified island will result in catastrophic casualties. This analysis was not wrong, based on the evidence available. In 1941, the American military did lack effective landing craft. The Navy had fewer than 50 specialized amphibious vessels. Most were slow, vulnerable, and required favorable beach conditions. The Japanese calculation was that even if Americans attempted an island assault, they could land perhaps 500 to 1,000 men in the first wave. A force easily contained and destroyed by concentrated defensive fire. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was the American industrial response once war began. Andrew Higgins's simple design was perfect for mass production. The boats used plywood, an abundant material. They required no specialized shipyard facilities. Small boatyards, furniture factories, even piano manufacturers could be converted to build them. Higgins Industries expanded from 7 employees in 1940 to 20,000 by 1943. By the time of the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, the United States had ordered more than 1,000 Higgins boats, officially designated the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. By mid-1942, that number had grown to 5,000. By 1943, Higgins and other manufacturers were producing more than 600 boats per month. The scale was unprecedented. No military in history had possessed such amphibious lift capacity. The transformation was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. The Higgins boat changed what was possible in amphibious warfare. Previously, landing operations required lengthy preparations, specialized equipment, and favorable conditions. With the LCVP, Marines could assault almost any beach, in almost any conditions, with minimal preparation. The boat's shallow draft meant it could operate where larger craft couldn't. The bow ramp meant troops could exit quickly, maintaining unit cohesion under fire. Japanese military observers noted American amphibious operations at Guadalcanal in August 1942 with growing concern. Intelligence reports described hundreds of small landing craft delivering wave after wave of Marines with mechanical efficiency. But Japanese analysts still underestimated the strategic implications. They saw the Higgins boat as a tactical tool, not a revolution in warfare. Their planning continued to assume that a determined defender with prepared positions could repel any amphibious assault through sheer firepower. This assumption would be tested most dramatically at Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, lying 650 nautical miles south of Tokyo. The island had no strategic value except its location. It sat directly beneath the flight path of B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas to strike Japan, Japanese fighters based on Iwo could intercept the bombers. More importantly, damaged B-29s could not reach the Marianas without an emergency landing strip. Iwo Jima could provide that strip, if the Americans could take it. In June 1944, Emperor Hirohito appointed Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi to command Iwo Jima's defense. Kuribayashi was one of Japan's most capable officers, a cavalry commander who had served as military attaché in Washington in the 1920s. Unlike many of his colleagues, he understood American industrial power and had no illusions about Japan's prospects in a protracted war. His task was not to win, but to make the Americans pay the highest possible price for every inch of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi had 21,000 men, a mixed force of Imperial Army and Navy troops. He had 8 months to prepare. He studied American amphibious operations at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, analyzing their methods, looking for weaknesses. His conclusions shaped one of the most formidable defensive systems ever constructed. The general understood that traditional beach defense, concentrating forces at the waterline to repel invaders in the surf, had failed repeatedly against American firepower. At Tarawa, Japanese troops manning beach fortifications were annihilated by naval gunfire before the Marines even landed. Kuribayashi would not repeat that mistake. Instead, he ordered his men to dig. Iwo Jima's volcanic rock was soft enough to tunnel, but strong enough to withstand bombardment. Over 8 months, Japanese engineers excavated 11 miles of underground passages connecting gun positions, command posts, barracks, and supply depots. The network went as deep as 90 feet in some places. Concrete reinforced chambers housed artillery pieces, including 320 guns larger than 75 millimeters, 1,300 pillboxes, and bunkers covered every approach to the beach. Everything was camouflaged, hidden beneath the black volcanic sand. Kuribayashi's defensive concept was revolutionary. He would allow the Americans to land unopposed. The beaches would appear empty, lightly defended. Marines would come ashore in their thousands, believing the pre-invasion bombardment had been effective. Only when they were fully committed, when the beach was crowded with men and equipment, would the trap spring. Hidden guns would open fire simultaneously from positions the Americans hadn't even located. Interlocking fields of fire would turn the beach into a killing ground. No heroic banzai charges, no wasted lives in futile counterattacks, just methodical, disciplined fire from concealed positions, bleeding the Americans for every yard. The general war gamed the American assault repeatedly. His intelligence staff estimated the Marines would land between 20 and 30,000 men in the first wave, using conventional landing craft and some of the newer tracked amphibious vehicles. Japanese observers had noted these LVTs, landing vehicles, tracked at previous operations. They were slow, lightly armored, vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. Kuribayashi positioned his heaviest guns to target the LVTs as they crawled ashore. What his planning failed to account for was the sheer scale of the American amphibious fleet and the speed with which Higgins boats could deliver reinforcements. Japanese calculations assumed that even with improved landing craft, the Americans could not possibly land more than 5,000 or 6,000 troops per hour. The math seemed inescapable. Each boat carried 36 men. Even assuming several hundred boats and perfect efficiency, there were physical limits to how many craft could approach a beach simultaneously without creating a chaotic traffic jam. But American planners had solved this problem through industrial overkill and obsessive organization. The invasion fleet assigned to Iwo Jima included 450 Higgins boats operating from 70 transport ships. The Navy had developed a sophisticated system for loading, launching, and vectoring waves of landing craft. Each transport carried multiple boats on davits. Crews could launch them in minutes. Once in the water, the boats circled in designated assembly areas offshore, forming into waves of 8 to 12 craft each. A control vessel coordinated timing, ensuring waves hit the beach at precise intervals. The system allowed for a sustained delivery rate of 10,000 men per hour under ideal conditions. Over the course of a day, That meant the potential to land more than 100,000 troops on a single beach, a scale of amphibious assault that had never before been attempted in military history. On February 16, 1945, the pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima began. For 3 days, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the island with thousands of tons of high explosive. Navy pilots flew hundreds of sorties, dropping bombs and napalm on suspected gun positions. The island disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and volcanic dust. To observers offshore, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such punishment. In his underground command post, General Kuribayashi monitored the bombardment calmly. His fortifications were designed to withstand exactly this type of attack. The deep bunkers absorbed the shock. Carefully camouflaged gun positions remained undiscovered. He had forbidden his troops from returning fire, knowing that revealing their positions would invite more accurate naval gunfire. "Let the Americans believe they have destroyed us," he told his officers. "Let them land confidently. Then we strike." On the evening of February 18th, aboard the command ship USS El Dorado, Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith conducted his final briefing. The 5th Amphibious Corps would assault Iwo Jima with 3 divisions, the 4th Marine Division on the right, the 5th Marine Division on the left, and the 3rd Marine Division in floating reserve. The first wave would consist of 68 tracked LVTs carrying Marines directly onto the beach. Following closely would be wave after wave of Higgins boats delivering the main assault force. Smith was a hard man, nicknamed Howlin' Mad for his volcanic temper and aggressive tactics. He had commanded amphibious operations across the Pacific and had seen the cost of storming defended islands. Intelligence estimated Japanese strength at 13,000 to 14,000 troops. Smith's staff calculated the island could be secured in 5 days with moderate casualties. The general was skeptical. Looking at aerial photographs of Iwo Jima's terrain, he saw volcanic ridges, ravines, and the ominous bulk of Mount Suribachi dominating the southern beaches. "This one will be tough," he told his staff. "Expect at least 10 days and significant casualties." Even Smith's pessimistic estimate underestimated what awaited on that black sand beach. The Japanese had 21,000 men, not 14,000. Their defensive positions were far more extensive than American intelligence had detected, and General Kuribayashi had no intention of surrendering. After 10 days, or even 10 weeks, he had issued a final order to his troops. "Each man will make it his duty to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. We will fight to the last man." At 0300 hours on February 19th, loudspeakers on the transport ships crackled to life. "Land the landing force." 5,000 Marines ate their final meal, steak and eggs, traditional for men going into combat, and began the complex process of loading into landing craft. In the cargo holds, NCOs checked equipment one last time: rifles, ammunition, grenades, demolition charges, flamethrowers, radios, stretchers. Each man carried between 60 and 100 pounds of gear. At 0345, the Higgins boats began lowering from davits. Sailors worked in practiced rhythm, unhooking cables, starting engines, guiding the small craft away from the motherships. In the darkness, the boats circled in their assembly areas, engines burbling, waiting for dawn. Inside each craft, Marines sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, gripping their rifles, saying nothing. Some prayed, others stared at the deck. A few joked nervously. Most simply waited, lost in private thoughts about what the next hours would bring. Corporal James Bradley sat in the 5th wave, scheduled to land at 0930. He was a Navy corpsman, a medic attached to the Marines. His job was to keep men alive once the shooting started. He carried no rifle, just medical supplies and a terrible knowledge of what high-velocity bullets and shrapnel did to human bodies. Around him, the Marines of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, prepared themselves mentally for the ordeal ahead. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0640, the naval bombardment reached a crescendo. Every ship in the fleet opened fire simultaneously. The sound was physical, a pressure wave that compressed the air and made breathing difficult. Iwo Jima vanished beneath a curtain of flame and smoke. For 40 minutes, the shelling continued without pause. Sailors on the ships believed nothing could survive such fury. They were wrong. At 0805, the bombardment lifted. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the rumble of landing craft engines. The first wave of LVTs formed a line 3,000 yards offshore and began their run to the beach. Marines watched the black sand grow closer, expecting at any moment to see the flash of enemy guns. Nothing. The island looked dead. At 0900 hours exactly, the first LVT ground onto the beach at the base of Mount Suribachi. Its ramp dropped. Marines poured out onto volcanic sand that gave way beneath their boots like ash. More LVTs landed to left and right. Within minutes, hundreds of Marines were ashore, spreading out, advancing inland. Still, no enemy fire. Men began to hope that the bombardment had been effective, that Japanese resistance would be light. Then Kuribayashi sprang his trap. At 0915, every Japanese gun on the island opened fire simultaneously. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles erupted from concealed positions. The beach exploded into chaos. Shells landed among the LVTs, destroying vehicles and killing their crews. Marines, caught in the open, threw themselves flat, trying to dig into sand that refused to hold. The volcanic soil was too loose, too fine. Foxholes collapsed as quickly as men could dig them. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover. Men could only press themselves into the black sand and pray. This is where the Higgins boats proved their value. Even as the beach became a killing ground, the waves of LCVPs kept coming, landing every few minutes with mechanical precision. The Navy coxswains, young sailors, many just 18 or 19 years old, drove their boats straight into hell, grounded them on the beach, dropped the ramps, and waited for Marines to disembark before retracting back into the water for another load. The courage required for this duty cannot be overstated. Japanese gunners targeted the landing craft deliberately, knowing that each boat destroyed meant 36 fewer Marines reaching the beach. Shells exploded in the water around the boats. Machine gun bullets stitched across their plywood hulls. Some boats took direct hits and disintegrated, killing everyone aboard. Others made it to the beach, only to have their ramps jammed by enemy fire, trapping Marines inside. Coxswains worked frantically to free the ramps or simply ordered Marines to go over the sides. Corporal Bradley's boat hit the beach at 0935, exactly on schedule. The ramp dropped and he stumbled forward into a scene from nightmare. The beach was carpeted with wounded men, their screams barely audible over the explosions. Destroyed vehicles burned, sending columns of oily smoke into the sky. Bodies lay in the surf where they had fallen. Bradley forced himself forward, looking for anyone he could help, anyone still alive who might be saved. The Japanese fire was devastating precisely because it was disciplined. Kuribayashi had forbidden his troops from firing wildly. Every shot was aimed. Gunners targeted Marines advancing from the beach, knowing that the more men they killed inland, the more congestion they would create on the beach itself. The strategy worked. Within 2 hours, the beach was so crowded with troops, equipment, and casualties that each new wave of Higgins boats had difficulty finding space to land. But the Americans adapted. Shore parties, organized by the Navy's construction battalions, Seabees, began clearing obstacles and marking safe lanes through the chaos. Medical corpsmen established aid stations just off the beach, creating assembly points for wounded men awaiting evacuation. Military police directed traffic, moving units forward as soon as they landed to prevent congestion. And the Higgins boats kept coming, wave after wave, delivering not just troops, but critical supplies, ammunition, water, medical equipment, communications gear, flamethrowers, and demolitions. By noon on D-Day, 30,000 Marines were ashore despite horrific casualties and chaotic conditions. This number exceeded Japanese planning assumptions by a factor of 5. General Kuribayashi, receiving reports in his command post, struggled to comprehend the scale. His observers reported that the landing craft seemed endless, that for every boat destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Americans were landing troops faster than Japanese guns could kill them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The sheer industrial capacity represented by those 450 Higgins boats was something the Japanese military had never encountered. Each boat could make 4 to 6 trips per day between ship and shore, meaning theoretical capacity to transport more than 50,000 men daily. Even accounting for boats damaged, lost, or under repair, the Americans could sustain a delivery rate that overwhelmed any defensive plan, based on pre-war assumptions about amphibious warfare. By nightfall on February 19th, 56,000 Marines were ashore. Japanese defenders, who had expected to contain and destroy an initial landing force of perhaps 20 to 30,000, now faced an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 3 to 1. More critically, American control of the beach meant supplies flowed continuously. Tanks, artillery, and heavy equipment that Japanese planners assumed would never reach shore were already being offloaded and moved into combat positions. The cost had been terrible. The first day's casualties exceeded 3,000 Marines killed or wounded, the highest single-day loss of any Pacific operation to that point. Offshore, the Higgins boat crews had suffered proportionally heavy losses. 32 boats were destroyed completely, more than 100 were damaged, 60 sailors were dead, another 100 wounded. But the system kept functioning. Damaged boats were replaced from reserve stocks. Wounded coxswains were relieved by fresh crews. The rhythm of landing operations never faltered. In the coming days and weeks, the battle for Iwo Jima would become one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. The fighting would last 36 days, not the 5 or 10 initially predicted. American casualties would eventually reach 26,000, including 6,800 killed. Japanese casualties approached 21,000, with only 216 taken prisoner. Nearly every Japanese defender fought to the death, just as Kuribayashi had ordered. But the outcome was never truly in doubt after that first terrible day. Once the Marines were ashore in overwhelming numbers, once American artillery and tanks were landed and operational, once the logistics train was established, Japanese defeat became a mathematical certainty. The question was not whether the Americans would win, but how long it would take and at what cost. General Kuribayashi understood this. On the evening of February 19th, he sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The enemy's naval and air bombardment since dawn today is beyond description. Despite this, our garrison fights bravely. However, the scale of the enemy's landing force far exceeds our estimates. They possess the capacity to deliver unlimited reinforcements. Unless the situation changes dramatically, the eventual result is not in doubt. That assessment was brutally accurate. The Higgins boats had made possible something that no previous military force in history had achieved: the rapid delivery of an entire army directly onto a hostile shore, defended by prepared fortifications and determined troops. The Japanese defensive plan, sound in conception and brilliant in execution, had been overwhelmed by sheer logistical capacity. The irony was that Andrew Higgins's simple design, ridiculed by naval architects, dismissed by professional military planners, had accomplished what no sophisticated warship or advanced weapon could match. It had transformed amphibious assault from a desperate gamble into a reliable military operation. In doing so, it had rendered obsolete centuries of defensive doctrine, based on the assumption that a defender with prepared positions and interior lines held an insurmountable advantage against an amphibious attacker. The fighting on Iwo Jima ground on with terrible intensity. Each yard of volcanic soil had to be taken through close combat. Grenades, flamethrowers, and demolitions used to clear bunkers one at a time. Marines advancing inland faced the same disciplined, concealed fire that had devastated the beach. Japanese defenders fought from interconnected tunnel systems, appearing suddenly to ambush advancing units, then disappearing underground before American firepower could be brought to bear. Mount Suribachi, the 546-foot volcanic peak dominating the southern end of the island, became an early objective. Japanese observers on its summit could direct fire across the entire landing area. On February 23rd, after 4 days of brutal fighting, a patrol from the 28th Regiment reached the summit and raised an American flag. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. Marines struggling to erect a larger replacement flag against the wind. That photograph would become the most iconic image of the Pacific War, symbolizing Marine Corps determination and sacrifice. But flag raising did not mean victory. The bulk of the island remained in Japanese hands. Kuribayashi's main defenses lay in the north, where ridges, ravines, and hills provided perfect terrain for defense. The most formidable position was Hill 362 Able, a knot of fortified terrain that commanded the central plateau. Marines would spend 3 weeks reducing this position, suffering thousands of casualties in the process. Throughout all this fighting, the Higgins boats maintained their rhythm. Each day, they delivered fresh troops, carried wounded back to hospital ships, and transported supplies forward. The scale of logistics required to sustain 50,000 Marines in combat was staggering. Each man required water, food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Artillery pieces needed constant replenishment of shells. Tanks consumed fuel and spare parts. Radio batteries had to be replaced. The 1,000 mundane necessities of modern warfare flowed across those black volcanic beaches in an unending stream, carried by the simple plywood boats the Japanese planners had never imagined could operate at such scale. Corporal Bradley worked without rest for days, treating wounded Marines and evacuating them to the beach for transport back to the ships. The medical challenges were overwhelming. The volcanic soil contaminated wounds, causing infections. Shell fragments created terrible injuries that required immediate surgery. Many wounded men died waiting for evacuation simply because the volume of casualties exceeded medical capacity. Bradley and his fellow corpsmen worked in impossible conditions, performing emergency medicine under fire, making life-and-death decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. By early March, American forces controlled 2/3 of the island. Japanese resistance was contracting, but not collapsing. Kuribayashi conducted a fighting retreat, pulling his forces back into prepared positions in the north, maintaining disciplined fire, never wasting ammunition in futile gestures. His radio messages to Tokyo became increasingly fatalistic, but never defeatist. He reported losses honestly, requested no reinforcements he knew could not be sent, and simply informed his superiors that his garrison would fulfill its duty to the end. On March 16th, the United States declared Iwo Jima secure. It was a bureaucratic formality. Fighting would continue for another 10 days. Small groups of Japanese defenders held out in caves and bunkers, emerging at night to conduct raids before withdrawing back underground. American casualties continued to mount. Every patrol, every advance into contested terrain, every attempt to clear a suspected position risked death or injury. General Kuribayashi sent his final message to Tokyo on March 17. The battle is approaching its end. Since the enemy landed, even the gods would weep at the bravery of the officers and men under my command. In particular, I am pleased that our forces inflicted great casualties on the enemy. My men died without yielding a step. I am very proud of them. I apologize to His Majesty that I let Iwo Jima fall into enemy hands. I ask the forgiveness of the people. I will fight to the last to defend this outpost and will defend the national honor. I pray for a lasting victory for the Empire. He was killed in action on March 26 during a final counterattack. His body was never found. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, 20,800 died. Only 216 were captured, most of them wounded and unconscious. It was the highest percentage of combat deaths of any battle in the Pacific War. American casualties were equally devastating. 6,821 Marines killed, 19,019 wounded. For the first and only time in the Pacific War, American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. 1/3 of all Marines who landed on Iwo Jima became casualties. 27 medals of honor were awarded for actions on the island, more than any other single battle in American history. 14 were awarded posthumously. The cost shocked the American public and military leadership. Was this volcanic rock worth such sacrifice? The answer became clear in the months that followed. B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to strike Japan began using Iwo Jima for emergency landings. Damaged aircraft that would have crashed into the ocean limped to Iwo's captured airfields and landed safely. By war's end, 2,400 Superfortress bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving an estimated 27,000 aircrew lives. Fighter escorts based on Iwo began accompanying the bombers all the way to Tokyo, dramatically improving their survival rates. The island became a navigation checkpoint and a psychological boost for bomber crews, knowing that if their aircraft was damaged, salvation lay halfway home. In purely military terms, capturing Iwo Jima shortened the war and saved lives, both American and Japanese, by making the strategic bombing campaign more effective and reducing the need for even bloodier operations. But beyond these tangible benefits, Iwo Jima demonstrated conclusively what the Higgins boat had made possible: an amphibious assault against a heavily fortified position, defended by determined troops with months to prepare, could succeed through sheer logistical superiority. The lesson was not lost on military planners preparing for the invasion of Japan itself. American forces were planning to land more than 1 million troops on the Japanese home islands, using thousands of Higgins boats to deliver overwhelming force directly onto defended beaches. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made that invasion unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15th, ending World War II. But planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, would have resulted in casualties exceeding anything seen at Iwo Jima or Okinawa. American estimates ranged from 400,000 to over 1 million casualties. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would have been exponentially higher, potentially reaching into the tens of millions. The Higgins boats' contribution to Allied victory extended far beyond Iwo Jima. In the European theater, more than 12,000 LCVPs participated in Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. On D-Day alone, Higgins boats landed more than 130,000 troops on French beaches. The boats were used in Operation Torch in North Africa, Operation Husky in Sicily, Operation Shingle at Anzio, and Operation Dragoon in southern France. In the Pacific, they participated in every major amphibious operation from Guadalcanal through Okinawa. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, called Andrew Higgins the man who won the war for us. It was hyperbole, but contained essential truth. Without the LCVP, Allied strategy in both theaters would have been impossible. The ability to deliver overwhelming force directly onto contested beaches, to sustain armies in the initial vulnerable phase of amphibious assault, to maintain logistics under fire. All of this depended on Higgins' simple design. The boat's impact extended beyond World War II. The basic concept, a shallow draft craft with bow ramp for rapid unloading, became standard for amphibious operations. Worldwide, modern landing craft are larger, faster, and more sophisticated, but they follow the same fundamental principles that Higgins established. The United States Marine Corps built its entire operational doctrine around amphibious assault, confident that the technical means existed to storm virtually any beach. That confidence rested on the foundation laid by a Louisiana boat builder who never finished high school. Andrew Higgins himself became a controversial figure during the war. His New Orleans factory employed 20,000 workers at peak production, including thousands of black workers in skilled positions, unusual for the segregated South of the 1940s. Higgins paid equal wages regardless of race and publicly challenged discrimination, earning both praise and condemnation. His abrasive personality and refusal to defer to military and naval bureaucracy created conflicts with procurement officials. But his boats kept coming off the production line, and that was what mattered. After the war, Higgins Industries collapsed quickly. Military contracts vanished. The company diversified into trucks, prefabricated housing, and even helicopters, but nothing succeeded. Higgins himself died in August 1952, largely forgotten and nearly bankrupt. The man who had revolutionized warfare and whose designs had carried millions of troops into battle passed away in relative obscurity. Today, his grave in New Orleans is visited primarily by military historians and Marine Corps veterans who understand what he accomplished. The irony of the Higgins boat story is that its success rested on qualities the military initially rejected. Professional naval architects wanted sophisticated designs incorporating the latest technology. Higgins gave them plywood and simple mechanics. Military planners wanted craft that could operate in perfect conditions. Higgins designed for worst-case scenarios, rough seas, hostile fire, and unskilled crews. The establishment wanted elegant engineering. Higgins provided brutal functionality. This pattern repeated throughout the war. The weapons and systems that proved most effective were often the simplest and most robust. The M1 Garand rifle, the Sherman tank, the Jeep, the C-47 transport aircraft. None were the most advanced designs available, but all were reliable, mass-producible, and good enough to get the job done. American victory in World War II rested less on technological sophistication than on industrial capacity and pragmatic engineering. The Japanese failure to anticipate the impact of the Higgins boat reflected a broader misunderstanding of American military culture. Japanese planners, trained in a tradition that valued elegance, efficiency, and doing more with less, could not imagine an opponent who would deliberately choose the brute force solution. They assumed Americans would attack defended positions only when they had overwhelming advantages in firepower and position. They could not conceive of an enemy who would accept terrible casualties in a direct assault, trusting industrial capacity to replace losses and maintain pressure until defenders collapsed. This cultural difference manifested in multiple ways. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese aircraft were lighter, more maneuverable, and had longer range than their American counterparts, but they lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. One good hit would destroy them. American planes were heavier, less agile, but could absorb tremendous damage and return to base. Japanese strategy assumed that superior skill and spirit would compensate for material inferiority. American strategy assumed that adequate skill, backed by overwhelming material superiority, would eventually win, regardless of enemy courage or determination. At Iwo Jima, these competing philosophies reached their ultimate expression. General Kuribayashi's defensive plan was brilliant, making maximum use of terrain and limited resources. His troops fought with extraordinary courage and discipline, but they were ground down by an enemy who could afford to trade casualties for time, who could land 100,000 troops in 5 days, who could sustain those troops with unlimited ammunition, food, water, and medical care, and who would continue attacking day after day, regardless of losses. The price of that victory horrified Americans at the time and continues to provoke debate among historians. Was Iwo Jima worth 6,800 marine lives? Could the island have been bypassed, isolated, and left to wither? Should the pre-invasion bombardment have lasted longer, done more damage to Japanese fortifications? These questions have no definitive answers. What is certain is that, given the strategic objectives and operational doctrine of 1945, American commanders believed Iwo Jima had to be taken, and they possessed the means, in the form of 450 Higgins boats, to take it. The legacy of that battle endures in Marine Corps culture. Iwo Jima represents both the apex of amphibious assault doctrine and a cautionary tale about the cost of frontal attacks on prepared defenses. Every Marine learns the story of Iwo Jima, memorizes the names of the Medal of Honor recipients, and understands that their corps earned its reputation through willingness to undertake missions other services considered impossible. That reputation rested on a foundation of humble plywood boats, designed by a man the military establishment initially dismissed. The Higgins boat was not glamorous. It never appeared on propaganda posters. No movies celebrated its role. But it was the essential tool that made American victory in the Pacific possible. Without it, the island-hopping campaign could not have been executed. Without it, the invasion of Europe would have failed or been delayed for years. Without it, the war would have lasted longer and cost more lives. In the annals of military technology, certain weapons achieve fame because they are revolutionary. The longbow, the cannon, the machine gun, the aircraft carrier, the atomic bomb. The Higgins boat belongs in that category, not because it was sophisticated, but because it fundamentally changed what was possible in warfare. It made the impossible. Landing an entire army on a defended beach, routine. That achievement, more than any single weapon or battle, determined the outcome of World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.